There are moments in a person's life that arrive without ceremony, without any of the dramatic framing that the mind tends to apply in retrospect, that simply appear in the ordinary light of an ordinary morning and proceed to change everything. Marion Ashby had lived long enough to know this. She had been through enough of those moments, the kind that wear the costume of routine right up until they don't, to understand that the most significant thresholds rarely announce themselves. She had not expected this particular Thursday morning in October to be one of them. She had not expected much from it at all, which was perhaps why it found her so precisely and with such lasting force. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She was standing at the kitchen window of the house on Elm Grove Drive when it happened, holding her coffee with both hands the way she always held it in the early morning before the house fully warmed, watching the sugar maple at the edge of the lawn doing what it did every October, turning from the outside in, the tips of its branches going first to gold and then to a red so deep it looked lit from the inside. Gerald had planted that tree the year they moved in, 37 years ago. He had planted it on a Saturday afternoon with Christopher helping, or attempting to help, and she had watched them from this exact window with the uncomplicated happiness of someone who does not yet know how finite the good days are. The maple was enormous now. It had outlasted Gerald by nearly 2 years and would outlast her by considerably more, which she had decided sometime in the spring was not a melancholy thought but simply a true one, and that truth had its own quiet dignity. She was 81 years old, and she was paying attention, which was perhaps the most she could say for herself on any given morning. She was not sentimental about it. She was paying attention. Diana had called on a Tuesday. This was not unusual. Diana called every Tuesday at precisely 7:45 in the morning, which Marion had come to understand was not evidence of devotion so much as evidence of scheduling, of a woman who managed her obligations the way she managed everything else, with color-coded calendars and optimized efficiency and the satisfied hum of someone who has never once wondered whether efficiency is the correct metric for love. Diana was 58 years old, which was old enough, Marion had always thought, to understand the difference. She had not yet come to that understanding, but Marion had stopped expecting it. The Tuesday call had begun in the usual way. Diana asked about her sleep, her appetite, her medication, whether she had spoken to her doctor about the follow-up appointment that Diana had taken the liberty of scheduling without being asked, and then, with the practiced lightness of someone delivering information they have already decided upon, she had said that she and Christopher and Helen had been talking, and they were all in agreement, and they wanted Marion to understand that they were doing this out of love, and that Maplecrest had an opening, and they had put down the deposit. Marion had stood in this kitchen with the phone against her ear and listened to her eldest daughter explain in careful, organized language, the language of someone who has rehearsed the conversation and anticipated the objections, that the Maplecrest Senior Living Community in Westfield had an available suite, that it was a very well-regarded facility, that several of Diana's colleagues had placed their own parents there with tremendous satisfaction, that the move-in date was the 14th of October, and that all 3 of them had agreed this was the right decision. Marion had not been consulted about whether it was the right decision. She had set her coffee cup down on the counter with a steadiness that surprised her, because steadiness was what was available to her in that moment, and she had listened to the remainder of what Diana said, and she had said very little in return. She had said she understood. She had said she would think about it. She had said goodnight, though it was morning, a slip she had noticed and corrected, and Diana had made a small sound that might have been concern or might have been impatience, and the call had ended. That had been 9 days ago. She had spent 9 days thinking about it, though thinking was not precisely the right word. Sitting with it was closer. She had sat with the fact of what her children had arranged, the way you sit with something that is very large and has arrived in your life without your permission, understanding that running from it or raging at it would accomplish nothing, that the only available response was to be still and wait until the thing showed you its full shape. The full shape of it was this. Her 3 children, who loved her, she did not doubt that, who loved her in the imperfect and occasionally suffocating way of people who confuse management with care, had looked at their 81-year-old mother living alone in the house on Elm Grove Drive, and had decided that she was a problem requiring a solution. They had consulted with each other about the solution. They had researched facilities. They had selected one. They had paid a deposit. They had assigned a date. And then they had called her on a Tuesday morning to inform her of what had been decided on her behalf, about her life, by people who were not living it. She was 81. She was not confused. She was not frail beyond what 81 years ordinarily produces. She still drove. She still cooked. She still read for 2 hours every evening and did the crossword in pen. She still walked to the post office on Tuesdays and to the library on Thursdays and to the farmer's market on Saturday. Mornings when the weather permitted, which it usually did, because she was not someone who allowed inconvenient weather to rearrange her intentions. Her doctor had told her at her last appointment, with the uncomplicated candor of someone who has always preferred honesty to reassurance, that she was in remarkable shape for a woman of her age, and she had thanked him and told him she intended to stay that way. None of this had been mentioned in Diana's call. Or in Christopher's brief, apologetic follow-up call 2 days later, Christopher, who had always found it easier to support whatever Diana had decided than to form a position of his own. Or in Helen's call, which had lasted 40 minutes and had contained more genuine emotion than the other two combined, Helen being the youngest and the one who had inherited the capacity for feeling something without immediately converting it into a plan of action, but which had also ultimately landed in the same place, confirming the date, suggesting Marion might feel better once she had seen the suite, which had a very nice view of a courtyard garden. Marion had looked at her own garden while Helen described the courtyard. The perennial beds along the south fence were going dormant for the winter, the sedums bronze red, the ornamental grasses loose and feathery, the peonies cut back to their crowns. She had planted every one of those beds herself, first with Gerald and later alone, adding to them over decades the way you add to anything you love, carefully, without hurry, with the specific knowledge that comes from having tended something through every season long enough to know what it needs before it tells you. The suite at Maplecrest had a view of a courtyard. She said she would think about it, and she thanked Helen for calling, and she set the phone on the kitchen table and sat with her hands folded in her lap and listened to the house. Gerald Ashby had died on a Wednesday morning in April, 19 months ago, in the bedroom upstairs, with the window open because he had always preferred fresh air and she had given him that, whatever he wanted in the last weeks, whatever was within her power to give. He had been 83. They had been married for 52 years. The marriage had not been a simple one because no long marriage is simple, because the long ones survive precisely by becoming more complex over time, layering difficulty over comfort, misunderstanding over understanding, small betrayals over larger kindnesses, until what you have is not the uncomplicated thing you started with but something far more valuable, something that has been tested by 52 years of actual living and has held. She had not spoken of this to anyone in the 19 months since his death, because the people she might have spoken to were either gone themselves or too busy arranging her life to ask her how she was living it. The letter from the attorney had arrived on a Friday in August, 3 weeks after Diana's first conversation with Christopher about Maplecrest, though Marion had not known about that conversation then. She had been in the garden, cutting the last of the summer dahlias for the kitchen table, when she heard the mail drop through the slot in the front door with the particular sound of a larger envelope landing on top of the smaller ones. She had gone inside, her garden gloves still on, and retrieved the stack from the floor and carried it to the kitchen, and she had seen the law firm's return address, Hargrove and Bales, attorneys at law, Burlington, Vermont, and she had not recognized it. She had set the other mail aside and opened the envelope with the small silver letter knife Gerald had kept in the kitchen drawer for 30 years, a habit she had inherited without deciding to, and she had read the letter standing at the counter with her garden gloves leaving faint soil marks on the envelope's edge. Constance Morrow had died in June, at the age of 97, in a farmhouse in the town of Aldercroft, Vermont, where she had lived for the last 40 years of her life. Constance Morrow had been the elder sister of Marion's late father, a woman Marion had met precisely 4 times in her life, at family gatherings spread across 5 decades, a tall, angular woman with white hair and an extremely direct gaze who had spoken very little but listened with an attention so complete it could feel uncomfortable, as though she were reading something in you that you had not intended to share. Marion had been told as a child that Constance was a woman who kept her own counsel, which was the family's way of explaining someone they could not quite categorize, and as an adult Marion had come to understand this description not as a criticism but as a form of respect, however confused. Constance Morrow had never married. She had no children. She had, according to the letter from Hargrove and Bales, left her estate, the farmhouse, and its surrounding 40 acres on Morrow Road in Aldercroft, to Marion Ashby, née Calloway, specifically, by name, to the exclusion of any other living relative, and with a handwritten instruction attached to the will that the attorney had transcribed verbatim and included on the second page of the letter. The instruction read, "She will know what to do with it. She always had more sense than the rest of them combined. Don't let anyone talk her out of keeping it." Marion had read those 2 sentences 3 times. She had looked out the window at the sugar maple. She had thought about Constance Morrow's direct gaze at a family gathering in 1989, the last time she had seen her, the way Constance had watched her from across the room with an expression Marion had not known how to interpret at the time, and now, 34 years later, reading this letter, thought she might finally understand. She had told none of her children about the letter. This was not a decision she made consciously, or with any particular forethought. It was simply the case that each time she had prepared to bring it up, something in her had gone quiet and still in a way that she had learned over 81 years to pay attention to. Her interior life had always communicated most clearly through its silences, through the things that paused before proceeding, and this particular silence had lasted from August into October, carrying the letter in her purse, reading it again some evenings in the study, looking at the name of the town, Aldercroft, finding it on a map, looking at the small green area labeled on the map's legend as protected agricultural land. The 14th of October was a Thursday. On the evening of the 13th, she set her coffee cup on the kitchen counter and went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed she had shared with Gerald for 52 years and looked at his side of it, which she had not changed, which still held the shape of his pillow exactly as he had kept it, flat in the center and folded up on one edge, a habit she had found inexplicable for decades and now found irreplaceable, and she thought about the deposit Diana had paid to Maplecrest, and about the suite with its courtyard view, and about her garden going dormant along the south fence, and about Constance Morrow's handwriting on the note attached to her will. She will know what to do with it. She went to the closet and she packed one suitcase. She was deliberate about it, the way she was deliberate about most things, choosing for utility and for the particular climate of Vermont in October, the wool sweaters, the good waterproof boots, the flannel-lined trousers, the heavy cardigan Gerald had given her for their 48th anniversary. She packed her medications in a zippered pouch. She packed a photograph of Gerald, framed in the small silver frame that lived on the nightstand. She packed the Bible her mother had given her when she was confirmed, which had traveled with her through every significant movement of her life for 66 years and was not the kind of thing you left behind. She packed 2 books from the nightstand stack and considered a third and decided against it. One suitcase. She was 81 years old and she had learned, through the accumulated refinement of decades, that most of what people carry is not what they need. She set the suitcase by the bedroom door. She went back to the closet and retrieved from the shelf the fireproof box where she and Gerald had kept their important documents, deeds and insurance policies and tax records, and she removed from it the original deed to the Elmgrove Drive property, Gerald's death certificate, their marriage certificate, and her own birth certificate, and she transferred these to the leather document folder she used for things that required safekeeping when she traveled. She put the attorney's letter from Hargrove and Bales in the document folder as well, and the folded copy of the Aldercroft property's legal description that she had printed from the county assessor's website on a Wednesday evening in September when the house was quiet and the maple outside was still fully green. She did not sleep particularly well. This was not unusual. Sleep had been a more complicated negotiation since Gerald's death, a fact she had mentioned to no one because it seemed to her a private matter. The recalibration of a body that had organized its resting around another person's presence for 5 decades and was still, 19 months later, making adjustments. She rose at 5. She dressed. She went downstairs and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window with it the way she always stood with it and watched the maple in the dark, its branches barely visible against the sky, the last of its leaves holding on in the way of things that are not yet ready to let go. At 6:15, she carried her suitcase to the car and put it in the trunk. She put the document folder on the passenger seat. She went back inside and turned off the coffee maker and the kitchen light and stood in the hallway for a moment in the gray morning, looking at the house. 50 years of ordinary life arranged itself around her in the silence. The staircase. The entry table where Gerald had always dropped his keys. The kitchen at the end of the hall with its window onto the garden. The whole accumulated weight of a life lived here, in these rooms, with this particular light at this particular hour, everything she had built and tended and loved in this house pressing in around her from every direction. She thought about the suite at Maplecrest and its courtyard garden. She thought about Diana's voice on the phone, organized and well-intentioned and utterly certain that it understood what Marion needed better than Marion did. She thought about Christopher's apologetic follow-up and Helen's 40 minutes of genuine, useless feeling, and she thought about the specific and irreversible nature of what her children had decided without her, for her, about her, and she felt something that she recognized after a moment as clarity. Not anger, though anger had been present and would perhaps return. Clarity. The particular quality of understanding that arrives when you have been still long enough and have finally seen the full shape of the thing. She locked the front door. She walked to the car. She did not look back at the house, because she had looked at it enough, and because looking back in moments like these was not, she had come to understand, a sign of love. It was a sign of fear. And she was not afraid. She was 81 years old and she had been through enough, had lost enough, had survived enough, to know the difference between leaving something behind and being left behind, and she knew precisely which one this was. The GPS on her phone showed 5 hours and 40 minutes to Aldercroft, Vermont. She pulled out of the driveway in the thin early light of a Thursday morning in October, and she drove north. She stopped. Once, at a gas station outside of Greenfield, Massachusetts, where she filled the tank and bought a coffee in a paper cup and used the restroom and stood beside the car in the cold morning air for a few minutes, looking at the sky, which had gone from the flat gray of early morning to a higher, more transparent blue that suggested the day intended to be clear. She was not accustomed to driving long distances alone. She and Gerald had always shared the driving, swapping at the halfway point of any trip longer than 2 hours, a system so established that she had sometimes sat in the passenger seat of her own car on the driver's side of an empty rest stop parking lot waiting for him to come back from the building before remembering, with the specific and particular vertigo of grief, that he would not be coming back. She drove the second half alone, which was simply the truth of things, and she was not going to waste time wishing it otherwise. Vermont announced itself the way Vermont always had for her, through a quality of air first, something crisper and more particular than the air of southern New England, and then through the trees, which were doing in their full October commitment what the sugar maple in her garden was only beginning, burning through every register of gold and red and amber and orange simultaneously, the hillsides blazing with it, the color so concentrated and so complete that it seemed less like a seasonal change and more like a decision the landscape had made about itself. She had always loved Vermont in October. She and Gerald had driven up once, perhaps 15 years ago, for a weekend in the fall foliage, staying at a small inn outside of Woodstock and eating dinner at a place with a fireplace and spending the days walking the back roads through hills like these. Gerald had photographed everything with his old film camera, whole rolls of it, landscapes and roadside stands, and Marion herself standing in meadows without knowing she was being photographed, which had been his habit, capturing her in the moments before she was ready, when her face was still itself rather than performing itself for a lens. She thought about those photographs and thought about the photographs on the walls of Constance Morrow's farmhouse, which she had not yet seen, which she was driving toward, which might contain anything or nothing, and she felt the particular quality of anticipation that is inseparable from uncertainty, the feeling of a person traveling towards something they cannot yet see but have decided, in some essential way, to trust. The town of Aldercroft appeared when she crested a long hill on Route 14 and the valley opened below her, small and self-contained in the way of Vermont towns that have always known exactly what they are. A white-steepled church at the center. A cluster of buildings around a small common. fields running out from the edges of town in every direction, the pastures brown gold in October, the tree lines along the field boundaries blazing. It was, she thought, exactly what it appeared to be, which was not something she could say about most places she had been. The GPS directed her off Route 14 onto a county road and then onto Morrow Road, which was unpaved and climbed gradually through a mixed woodland of birch and maple, the road narrow enough that she drove carefully, the Volvo's tires finding the packed gravel of the center track. Morrow Road. Named for the family, she supposed, which meant Constance had not come to this land by accident. She had come to it by inheritance or by design or by both, and she had stayed long enough for the road to carry her name. The farmhouse came into view around a bend in the road, set in a clearing where the trees stepped back and the land opened into a broad south-facing field, still green at its edges where the October frost had not yet fully reached. The house was old, older than she had expected, timber frame from the look of it, with a long covered porch across the front and 2 brick chimneys rising from either end of the roofline. Its clapboards had been painted at some point in the past and had faded to a color that could not be precisely named, a silver gray with undertones of what might once have been white or might once have been blue, weathered to a shade that looked deliberately chosen, the way things look when time has finished with them. A large barn stood behind and to the left of the house, its gambrel roof intact and its boards darkened by decades of weather to the color of old pewter. A stone wall ran along the northern edge of the clearing, the fieldstone fitted with the irregular precision of work done by hand over time, and beyond the wall the maples stood in their October fullness, the canopy so dense with color that the sky above it seemed almost secondary. She parked in the clearing in front of the house. She turned off the engine. She sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, looking through the windshield at the property in the bright October light, and she thought about Constance Morrow standing in this clearing, a woman in her 60s who had come to a place no one in the family had known about and had stayed for 40 years and had left it, at the end, specifically to Marion. She will know what to do with it. She always had more sense than the rest of them combined. Marion opened the car door and stepped out into the cold Vermont air. It smelled of fallen leaves and turned earth and the particular cleanness of autumn in a place where nothing is manufactured, where the air does not carry the residue of adjacent industry, where the world still smells the way it was made. She walked to the front porch. She took the attorney's letter from the document folder and reread the line that contained the information she needed, the number of the key lockbox on the porch post, which Hargrove and Bales had installed following Constance's death to preserve access for the estate's beneficiary. She found the lockbox, entered the combination, and retrieved a key on a plain metal ring with a paper tag attached bearing the house number and the street name written in a neat, unfamiliar hand. She stood at the front door of a house she had inherited from a woman she had met 4 times. She was 81 years old and she had been awake since 5 in the morning and she had driven nearly 6 hours alone and she had, as of this morning, no home to return to in any meaningful sense, which was not, she was discovering, as terrifying a realization as she might have predicted. It was something else. Something that did not yet have a word attached to it. Something that felt, in the cold October air on this porch in front of this door, more like a beginning than an ending. She put the key in the lock. She turned it. The door opened. The smell reached her before anything else. It was not the smell she had braced for, the damp and cold of a house that has been empty since June, the particular staleness of rooms that have been closed too long and have begun, in their closing, to lose the human quality that living gives to spaces. She had expected that. She had prepared for it with the practical optimism she brought to most things, the readiness to see past surface difficulty to the structure beneath, which was a habit formed not in any single moment but across decades of tending things other people had given up on. The smell that met her instead was cedar and wood smoke and something fainter beneath both of those, something dry and herbal that she could not immediately place but recognized in a way that bypassed language and went directly to memory, the way certain smells do, the way the smell of her mother's kitchen could still, at 81, produce in her a feeling that had no name but was completely specific. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The entry was narrow and low-ceilinged in the manner of houses built in an era when ceilings were kept close because heat was precious and every foot of vertical space was a negotiation with winter. The floorboards were wide pine, the same dark honey color as the boards in the kitchen of her own childhood home, worn to a smoothness that was not the smoothness of neglect but of long use, the beautiful compression of generations of footsteps moving through the same paths day after day until the wood itself recorded the shape of a life. A row of iron hooks along the left wall held coats. 3 of them. Constance's coats, still there, a heavy wool in charcoal gray, a canvas barn coat in faded olive, a long raincoat in navy that had seen considerable weather. Marion looked at them for a moment. The coats of a woman who had needed 3, who had lived in a climate that required different answers for different days, who had hung them on these hooks and taken them down from these hooks and who had, as of June, not come back for them. She moved through the entry into the main room and stopped. The room was large by the standards of the house's era, running the full width of the building, with windows on 3 sides that in the October afternoon light let in a brightness that made the space feel larger still. The ceiling showed the original hand-hewn beams, dark with age, the marks of the adze still visible in the surface of the wood in the way of things made before machines made precision effortless. The fireplace at the far end was built from field stone, the same gray stone as the walls she had passed on the drive-in, and it was substantial, the kind of fireplace that is the architectural argument for the entire room, around which everything else is organized. A basket of split hardwood sat beside the hearth, full. She understood immediately that this room had been lived in seriously and for a long time by someone who knew how to inhabit a space. Not decorated, not arranged for effect, but used, in the deep and settled way of someone who has organized their surroundings not around how the surroundings might appear to others but around what the surroundings need to be to sustain a particular kind of life. The books were everywhere, not as display but as working presence, on shelves that covered 2 walls from floor to ceiling and overflowed onto the wide window ledges and the surface of the low table beside the reading chair, which was positioned to receive both the fireplace's warmth and the light from the south window simultaneously, the chair of someone who had thought carefully about where to put it. The reading chair was old leather, cracked at the armrests in the pattern of long use, the seat cushion compressed in the center by years of the same body in the same position. On its left arm, an unfinished fold of knitting, needles still in place, the working yarn trailing to a ball of dark blue wool on the floor beside the chair's leg, as though Constance had set it down meaning to return. Marion stood in the center of the room and was very still for a long moment. She had met Constance Morrow 4 times in her life. She had not known her. She had known the idea of her, the family's idea, a woman who kept her own counsel, who had gone to Vermont and stayed and sent cards at Christmas and appeared at gatherings with her direct gaze and her quality of hearing everything and responding to very little. She had not known this room. She had not known the reading chair positioned for warmth and light. She had not known the books, which, she saw as she moved closer to the shelves, were organized not by author or genre or any of the conventional systems but by some internal logic that she could not immediately read, grouped in ways that suggested the mind behind the grouping had known exactly what it was doing even if the organizing principle was not immediately legible to a stranger. She was not yet sure she was a stranger here. That was the thing she was trying to determine. She moved through the room into the kitchen, which was at the back of the house and looked out over the field through 2 large windows above the farmhouse sink. The kitchen was a working kitchen in the truest sense, its surfaces marked by decades of actual cooking, the wooden chopping board on the counter worn concave at its center, the cast iron pans on the wall rack seasoned black with long use, the pottery on the open shelves mismatched in color but consistent in quality, the kind of pottery made by hand, bought from the people who made it. Objects that carry the evidence of having been chosen with attention rather than convenience. A bunch of dried herbs hung from a hook near the window, the source, Marion understood now, of the herbal smell she had not been able to identify in the entry. Lavender and something else. Rosemary, perhaps. She reached up and touched the dried stems and they crumbled slightly at her fingertip and released a small concentrated version of the smell. And she stood with her finger raised and the smell in the air around her and understood for the first time that she was going to be all right here. She did not know yet what here was going to be. She did not know what she was going to do about Elmgrove Drive or about Diana's deposit or about the children's calls that had not yet come, because they did not yet know she had not gone to Maplecrest. She had not told anyone where she was going. She had driven north and sent a single text to Diana from the gas station outside of Greenfield, a text that said, "I am well and safe. I will be in touch when I am ready. Please do not look for me." She had not, she was aware, made this easy for them. She was also aware, with a clarity that surprised her by its completeness, that making it easy for them was not the relevant consideration. She was 81 years old and she had spent the last 9 days sitting very still with the full shape of what her children had decided about her life, and what she had determined, in that stillness, was that dignity is not a negotiation. It is a position. You hold it or you surrender it, and the surrendering is always dressed up as something else, as practicality, as love, as the sensible and reasonable accommodation of people who know better. She was not going to surrender it. She had earned the right to that position through 8 decades of a life lived with attention and care, and she was not going to give it up on the 14th of October because her children had paid a deposit at Maplecrest and expected her to be grateful. She made tea on the gas range, which lit on the first try, and she stood at the kitchen window with the mug and looked out at the field in the late afternoon light. The field ran south from the back of the house for perhaps 200 yards before it met a line of birch trees at its lower edge, beyond which she could see, just visible, a glint of water. A pond, possibly. A stream. She would find out. She had time to find out, which was itself a remarkable thing to understand. She had time, the unallocated kind, the kind that belongs to you without condition. She found the letter on the kitchen table. She had not noticed it immediately because it was beneath the pottery bowl that held keys and a twist of twine and 2 smooth creek stones and a stub of beeswax candle, the accumulated small objects of a person's daily life gathered at a central point, and the envelope was under the bowl rather than on top of it, as though it had been placed there in advance with the deliberate concealment of something meant to be found only once you had looked around properly. The envelope had her name on it. Not her married name, her birth name, Marion Ruth Calloway, in Constance Morrow's angular, decisive handwriting, which she recognized from the Christmas cards that had arrived without fail every year for as long as she could remember, always signed with a single initial, C, and occasionally accompanied by a pressed botanical specimen, a fern frond or a maple leaf or a sprig of something dried, always without explanation. She sat down at the kitchen table. She opened the envelope. The letter was 2 pages, written on both sides of heavy cream paper in the same angular hand. Constance Morrow had not been a woman who softened her language for effect, and the letter reflected this, direct and precise and completely without the performative warmth of people who write for the appearance of connection rather than for its substance. "Marion," it began, without preamble. "You are here because I knew you would come, which is one of the few things I have been entirely certain of. You are also the only one in that family with the sense to understand what this place is, which is why it belongs to you and not to any of them. Please don't feel guilty about that. I gave it a great deal of thought over a long period of time and I am confident in the decision. You were always your father's daughter in the ways that mattered most. He would have understood this place. He would have known immediately what to do with it. I have been in Aldercroft since 1983. I came because I needed to be somewhere that required me to be entirely myself without accommodation, and this place allowed that. The town is small but it is not limited. The people here have the particular quality of people who have chosen a difficult life because they prefer honesty to comfort, and I have found their company more sustaining than any I encountered in the 40 years I spent trying to fit into spaces that were not shaped like me. You will find allies here before you expect to. The house is sound. I have maintained it with the help of a man named Declan Fosse who lives at the end of Morrow Road and who knows the property as well as anyone alive. He will come to see you within a day or 2 of your arrival. Because that is his way, and you should let him. He is not a man who over-explains himself and he is completely trustworthy, which are qualities I value above most others. There is a great deal I want to tell you about this property, about its history and about what it contains, which is more than it appears to contain from the outside. I will say only this much now, because the rest requires you to have been here long enough to understand the context. The land has a memory. All land does, but this land in particular has been holding something for a very long time, something that was sealed away before I came here and that I discovered only gradually over the course of many years, and that I ultimately decided was not mine to open. I believe it may be yours. I cannot be certain, but I believe it, which is as much certainty as anyone can honestly claim about anything. When you are ready, walk the eastern field to the old stone foundation at its far edge, the one the locals call the Miller Building, and look at the north wall. You will know what you are looking at when you see it. Trust what you know. I am sorry I did not know you better. That is the family's failure, not ours, and I want you to understand the distinction. I watched you from a distance for decades and I recognized in you something I recognized in myself, a person who understands that the world is not arranged correctly and who has chosen, despite this understanding, to keep tending their corner of it with love and with care. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the only thing that has ever mattered. The house is yours. The land is yours. Whatever is sealed in the eastern field has been waiting a long time and it can wait a little longer. Take the time you need to settle in. Drink tea in the kitchen. Read in the chair by the fire. Let the place show you what it is before you ask it to show you more. Yours, in the only honest sense of the word, Constance. Marion set the letter down on the kitchen table and sat for a long time without moving. Outside the kitchen window the field was going gold in the early evening light and the birch trees at its lower edge were turning their leaves slowly in a wind she could not hear from inside the house. She thought about her father, James Calloway, who had died 22 years ago and whom she had not thought of in connection with Constance in any particular way before now, though of course they had been siblings, of course the resemblance was there if she had thought to look for it. The particular quality of attention Constance had, the way of listening that felt like reading, that had been James Calloway's quality also, the thing she had loved most about her father, the feeling when she spoke to him that she was being fully received, that nothing she said was going to be minimized or redirected or replaced with something more convenient. She was glad Constance had known her father. She was glad someone in that family had known him the way she had known him. She folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in the document folder with the deed and the attorney's correspondence. Then she went upstairs to find where she was going to sleep. The bedroom at the top of the stairs was Constance's, clearly, its arrangement carrying the same internal logic as the room below, nothing chosen for appearance, everything chosen for use and for the particular quality of a space that has been inhabited by the same consciousness for 40 years and has taken on something of that consciousness's character. The quilt on the bed was hand-stitched, a double wedding ring pattern in dark blues and deep greens, old enough that the fabric had softened to the texture of worn cotton, the stitching tight and small in the way of someone who had learned to sew from someone who had learned it as a necessity rather than a leisure. A photograph on the dresser showed Constance standing in the eastern field, summer, the grasses long around her, her expression the one Marion remembered, direct and self-contained and carrying beneath its surface something that might have been happiness if happiness were something Constance allowed herself to display without reservation. She made the bed with clean sheets she found in the linen closet in the hall, folded and faintly scented with dried lavender tucked between them. She unpacked her suitcase into the empty half of the closet, which felt presumptuous and also perfectly correct, the way things feel when they are both new and somehow already known. Her phone had been ringing since 3 o'clock in the afternoon. She had silenced it before she left Greenfield that morning and had felt no particular urgency about unsilencing it, but she picked it up now and looked at the screen. 11 missed calls, 3 from Diana, 4 from Christopher, 2 from Helen, and 2 from a number she did not recognize that turned out, when she looked it up, to be the main line at Maplecrest Senior Living Community. She could imagine the conversation that had occurred when she failed to arrive. The front desk calling Diana. Diana calling Christopher. Christopher calling Helen. The three of them arranging a response with the coordinated efficiency of people who are skilled at managing things, who have always been skilled at managing things, who had in fact become so skilled at it that they had long since stopped distinguishing between the things that required managing and the people who did not. She did not call back. She sent a second text to Diana, brief and complete: I am in Vermont. I am safe and well and exactly where I need to be. I will call when I am ready to talk. Please tell Christopher and Helen. She pressed send and set the phone face down on the dresser beside Constance's photograph and went downstairs to make dinner. The pantry off the kitchen was stocked with the provisions of a woman who had lived alone in a rural Vermont town for 40 years and had never been unprepared for a hard winter. Dried beans and lentils, canned tomatoes, olive oil, good vinegar, a row of preserves in glass jars labeled in Constance's handwriting, apple butter, pickled beets, a dark plum jam that Marion opened and tasted from her fingertip and put immediately on the list of things she intended to understand better. There were potatoes in a wooden bin and onions hanging from a hook and a half-round of hard cheese wrapped in cloth on the second shelf. She made a simple soup from the potatoes and onions and a can of tomatoes and ate it at the kitchen table in the lamplight while the wind moved in the maples outside and the house settled around her with the small sounds that old houses make when the temperature drops at nightfall, the creak of timber and the breath of the walls, the sound of a building that has been doing this for a very long time and knows exactly how. She slept better than she had slept since April. Declan Fosse arrived the next morning at 8 o'clock, as Constance had said he would, coming up the front path in the particular way that Constance's letter had predicted, a man who did not over-explain himself, which Marion recognized in his first minute on the porch. He was perhaps 65, solidly built, with a face that had been outdoors in every kind of weather for most of its life and showed this honestly, and with the quality of stillness in his hands and his posture that belongs to people accustomed to working alone, who have made their peace with silence. He introduced himself by name and said he had looked after the property for Constance for 18 years and had heard from the attorney's office that the property had a new owner. He did not say he was sorry about Constance, which Marion noted and appreciated, because the people who say I'm sorry for your loss about someone else's loss before they know the nature of the loss are usually filling silence with convention rather than offering anything of substance. She made coffee and they sat at the kitchen table and he told her about the property with the organized precision of someone who has maintained something carefully and wants to ensure the handover is complete. The boiler was oil-fired and serviced annually in September, done already. The well water was tested each spring and was clean. The barn roof had been reshingled 3 years ago. The stone walls along the northern boundary needed pointing in 2 places. He had the materials, he would do it before the ground froze. The eastern field had not been hayed since Constance stopped keeping animals, which was 12 years ago, and was returning to meadow, which he considered an improvement. He told her these things without editorializing, without suggesting what she should do or what Constance had done or what the property required from its owner in terms of decisions or plans or intentions, which was its own form of respect. He was giving her information, not instructions. She found this distinction, in the second morning of her time in Aldercroft, more meaningful than she could easily explain. When he stood to leave she asked him about the Miller building, using the phrase from Constance's letter, and she watched his face as he processed the question, watched something shift behind his eyes in a way that was not quite surprise but was related to it, the look of someone who has known something was coming and is recalibrating the timeline now that it has arrived. He sat back down. The Miller building, he told her, was the remains of a foundation and partial structure at the far eastern edge of the property, the oldest structure on the land by at least 60 years, built in the late 1800s by a man named Ephraim Miller who had been the original owner of the acreage before it was subdivided over time and reduced to its current 40 acres. The Miller building had been a mill of some kind. The historical record was not precise on what was milled there, grain or timber or possibly both at different periods, and it had burned at some point in the first decade of the 20th century, the circumstances of the fire unrecorded, leaving only the stone foundation walls and a partial north wall of the original structure that had survived the fire, for reasons he had never quite understood, since the north wall was not the wall farthest from the fire's probable origin but was instead the wall closest to whatever had been inside. He paused here in the way of someone deciding how much to say. Constance had spent considerable time at the Miller building, he told her. More than the general maintenance of the property would require. He had noticed this over the years without commenting on it, because Constance was not a person you commented to without invitation and because her business on her own property was, self-evidently, her own. but he had observed it. He had observed her there in different seasons, in different weathers, sometimes with tools and sometimes without, and he had noticed in the last several years of her life that her visits to the building had become less frequent, not because she had lost interest in it but because, he believed, she had reached some conclusion about it that resolved the question she had been working on. He did not know what that conclusion was. She had not told him. He looked at Marion across the kitchen table. She asked him if he had ever been inside the north wall of the Miller building. "No," he said. "There's a door in that wall. It's been sealed as long as I've known the property. Constance told me once, must be 15 years ago now, that it wasn't hers to open. She said it the way she said things that were settled, so I took it as settled." He looked at her steadily, with the quality of a man who has decided to be entirely honest and is doing so. "She also told me," he said, "and this was the last thing she said to me about it before she died, that the right person would come eventually, and when they did, the door would be in the right hands." Marion held her coffee mug with both hands and felt the warmth of it in her palms and thought about a door in the north wall of a burned mill at the eastern edge of a Vermont field that she had inherited from a woman she had met 4 times and whom she had, apparently, been more alike than either of them had known. She was aware, in the way she was aware of most important things, slowly and completely and without the drama of sudden realization, that she had not come to Aldercroft on a Thursday morning in October simply to escape a suite at Maplecrest. She had come because something had been organized, over decades, by people who were no longer here to explain it, and the organization had been working toward exactly this, toward a woman of 81 sitting at a kitchen table with a cup of coffee being told about a sealed door that had been waiting for the right hands. She could not have said why she was certain of this. She was simply certain of it, with the quiet, unargumentable certainty that arrives in the body rather than in the mind and that she had learned, across a long life of paying attention, not to question. She walked the property that afternoon, beginning with the house and its immediate surroundings, the barn and the kitchen garden and the orchard of 4 old apple trees to the west of the barn that still held their fruit, small and russet and sweet. She tasted one, the kind of apple that exists in Vermont and almost nowhere else, the kind that has been growing on a specific piece of land for long enough to taste of that land specifically. She walked the stone wall along the northern boundary, running her hand along the fieldstone surface, feeling the roughness and the cold of it, the solidity of something built to hold ground and that had held it across more winters than anyone currently alive could account for. She walked south across the main field in the October afternoon light, the grasses brown and seed-heavy on either side of the path, and at the far edge of the field, where Declan had said she would find it, she found the Miller building. What remained of it was this: 3 stone foundation walls, waist-high, the stones dark with lichen and time, running in a rough rectangle across the far corner of the field where the land dropped slightly toward the tree line. Inside the rectangle, the ground was overgrown with the particular dense vegetation of a place that has been disturbed and then left to recover for many decades, goldenrod and wild aster and the dry stalks of things that had bloomed in summer and were now collapsed into the winter-ready brown of their own spent architecture. The 4th wall, the north wall, stood differently from the others. It was taller. Where the 3 foundation walls had been reduced to their lower courses by weather and time and possibly by someone who had dismantled the upper stones for use elsewhere, the north wall still stood nearly to its original height, perhaps 10 feet, its fieldstone courses irregular but solid, its mortar cracked and missing in places but not failed, the kind of wall that has survived not through perfect maintenance but through original quality, the craft of someone who had known how to lay stone in a way that made the work last beyond their own presence. And in that wall, visible once she was close enough, there was a door. It was not large. Perhaps 5 feet high, the kind of door that required a person to duck their head on entering, set into the stone in a wooden frame that was still in place despite the years, still plumb despite the wall's minor settling, still holding its integrity in the way of things made from good material and set with care. The door itself was solid plank construction, horizontal boards held together by 2 vertical battens, the wood darkened by weather to the same gray-silver as the exterior of the farmhouse, and it was sealed. Not locked, in the conventional sense. There was no keyhole she could see, no handle, no obvious mechanism. It was sealed along its edges with what appeared, on closer inspection, to be something deliberate rather than simply the adhesion of age and moisture. A compound of some kind had been worked into the gap between the door and its frame, going dark with age but still present, still intact, still holding the door in place in a way that was unmistakably intentional. This door had been sealed by someone who intended it to stay sealed until someone else decided otherwise. She stood before it in the October light and looked at it for a long time. The field was quiet around her. A crow called from somewhere in the birch trees at the far edge of the property and fell silent again. The wind moved through the dry goldenrod and the spent asters and the empty seed heads of whatever had grown here through the summer and made a small, unhurried sound that was not quite music and not quite anything else. She put her hand flat against the door's surface. The wood was cold, and beneath the cold, faintly, she thought she felt something, a slight difference in temperature along the sealed edge, as though the air on the other side of the door was a different temperature from the air on this side, as though the sealed space breathed. She stood there with her hand on the door until the light began to go and the air turned colder with the approach of evening, and then she walked back across the field to the farmhouse, where the kitchen lamp was still burning, where the pantry held provisions for the night's supper, where Constance Morrow's letter waited in the document folder on the kitchen table. Whatever is sealed in the eastern field has been waiting a long time and it can wait a little longer. She cooked supper and ate at the table and washed the dishes at the farmhouse sink and looked out the dark kitchen window at the dark field and thought about doors and about the things that wait behind them and about what it means to be the person who finally turns toward them. She was 81 years old. She had survived enough to know that the most important things rarely announce themselves. They wait. They wait for the right weather, the right hands, the right season of a life. She went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the house. Somewhere in the wall of the barn a timber shifted. The wind moved through the maples. The field was silent in the particular way of fields at night in October, everything folded inward, everything waiting for morning. Her phone was on the dresser, and at 10:43 it lit with a text from Diana that she read from across the room without picking it up. "Mom," it said. "We are trying to understand what's happening. Please call us. We love you." She looked at the lit screen for a moment, at her daughter's words, and she felt, precisely and without bitterness, the weight of what it costs to be loved by people who have confused love with custody. Then the screen went dark and the room was quiet again, and Marion Ashby closed her eyes and slept, in Constance Morrow's house, on Constance Morrow's land, 40 feet above a sealed door that had been waiting, with the patience of stone and old wood and whatever lay behind it, for a very long time. She spent 3 days in the Aldercroft town library before she found what she was looking for, sitting at a long wooden table in the back room where the historical records were kept in labeled archival boxes that smelled of old paper and the particular dusty patience of things that have been waiting a long time to be useful. The librarian, a woman named Vera Osgood who was perhaps 70 and who had the focused energy of someone who considers information retrieval a personal calling, had pulled 4 boxes without being asked on Marion's first morning and set them on the table with the quiet satisfaction of someone delivering exactly the right thing at exactly the right time. The Miller family had come to Aldercroft in 1871. Ephraim Miller had built the mill on the eastern acreage in 1879, a grain mill that had served the surrounding farms through the late 19th century and into the early 20th. He had been, from what the records showed, a man of unusual character for his era and his region, unmarried until late in life, meticulous in his record-keeping, involved in the early Vermont land conservation efforts of the 1890s in ways that appeared, from the correspondence preserved in the third archival box, to have generated considerable local controversy. His neighbors had not uniformly shared his convictions about land use and preservation. There were letters in the box from other Aldercroft landowners during the years 1895 through 1902 that made clear, in the careful language of men who wanted their objections recorded without appearing to make them directly, that Ephraim Miller's ideas about what the land owed to the future rather than the present were not welcome and were actively resisted. The mill fire had occurred in October of 1907. The Aldercroft Gazette from that month, preserved on brittle newsprint in a clear sleeve, reported it in 8 lines on the 3rd page. The fire's origin was listed as undetermined. No injuries were recorded. The mill's contents, described in the article as the personal effects and inventory of E. Miller, were considered lost. Marion read those 8 lines twice and then sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling of the Aldercroft Town Library and thought about a sealed door in a north wall that had survived a fire whose origin was undetermined. She thought about a man who had ideas about land and preservation that his neighbors had actively resisted. She thought about the words personal effects and inventory, and she thought about what a careful man with controversial convictions might have done in October of 1907 if he had understood, in advance, that a fire was coming. She thanked Vera Osgood on her way out and walked back to the farmhouse in the cold October morning and called Declan Fosse from the kitchen table. They went to the Miller building together the following day with the tools Declan had assessed would be needed, which he had gathered without drama and carried in a canvas bag with the efficient preparedness of someone who has been solving practical problems on this land for nearly 2 decades. The compound sealing the door's edges was old but not indestructible. It had been applied with the thoroughness of someone who intended permanence but had not, Marion understood now, intended impossibility. Ephraim Miller had sealed this door so that it could be kept closed, not so that it could never be opened. The distinction mattered. It took the better part of an hour, working carefully, neither of them rushing, the cold morning air carrying the smell of dried grass and birch bark, a crow calling intermittently from the tree line as though marking their progress. When the last of the compound had been worked free from the lower edge of the door and Declan stepped back and looked at her and said it was ready, Marion stood in front of the door for a long moment with her hands at her sides and felt the full weight of what the moment contained, not drama exactly, but the particular gravity of standing at the edge of something that has been closed for a very long time and is about to be opened by the person it was, perhaps, always meant for. She put both hands flat on the door's surface and pushed. It opened inward, slowly, the hinges stiff with age but not failed, the door swinging with a low sound that was not quite a groan and not quite a sigh but was somewhere between the two, the sound of something that has been holding itself closed for 117 years and is finally releasing the effort. The air that came out was cold and dry and carried that same herbal quality she had noticed in the farmhouse entry on her first afternoon, cedar and something else, something that she now recognized, standing in the open doorway with the October light at her back, as the specific smell of things that have been carefully preserved. She stood at the threshold and let her eyes adjust. The space inside the north wall was not large. Perhaps 12 feet across and 8 feet deep, the ceiling the underside of the original stone construction, the walls the inner faces of the field stone, and the floor packed earth, level and firm and dry in the way of a space that had been intentionally sealed against moisture as well as against entry. And in that small, dry, cold space, arranged with the deliberate order of someone who had known exactly what they were storing and exactly how to store it for the longest possible time, was the life's work of Ephraim Miller. There were paintings. 14 of them, wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them with extraordinary completeness, leaning in 2 rows against the interior walls, their edges visible where the oilcloth had been folded back at the corners as though someone had looked at them one final time before sealing the door. Vermont landscapes, she would learn later, painted between 1880 and 1905 by an artist named Caleb Marsh whose work had been largely unknown at the time of his death and had subsequently, over the course of the 20th century, become the subject of significant scholarly and commercial interest, his paintings held in museum collections from Burlington to Boston to a gallery in London that had acquired 3 of them in the 1970s for amounts that had seemed extraordinary at the time and would seem, in the present day, modest by comparison. There were documents. A wooden crate held ledgers and correspondence and what appeared to be legal instruments, all wrapped in waxed cloth and tied with waxed cord, the preservation so complete that when Marion carefully opened the outermost layer of one package the paper inside was still supple. Deeds to land Ephraim Miller had quietly purchased and placed under conservation protection in the years before the fire, land that had eventually become part of the Vermont state forest system without anyone knowing that the original impetus had come from a single unmarried grain miller in Aldercroft who had believed, against the consensus of his era, that some things belonged to the future rather than to whoever happened to own them in the present. And there was a letter, in a sealed envelope, placed on top of the nearest painting, addressed in a precise 19th-century hand to whoever finds this room and has the sense to understand what it is. Marion stood in the cold dry space and read Ephraim Miller's letter in the light from the open door, and what he had written was this: that he had sealed this room in the autumn of 1907, 2 weeks before the fire that he had understood was coming, because the people who opposed his ideas about the land had decided that destroying what he had built was preferable to allowing it to outlast him. That the paintings belonged to his friend Caleb Marsh's estate, to be returned to whoever held it. That the land documents represented 30 years of conservation work that he asked, simply and without condition, to be honored. And that the room itself, the fact that it had held through whatever came, was his answer to everyone who had told him that a man without property or family or conventional standing had nothing worth preserving. He had preserved it anyway. For whoever came with the sense to open the door. Dara Osgood came to the Miller building on the second day after the opening, at Marion's invitation, and stood in the doorway with both hands pressed to her mouth for a long moment before she spoke. She knew a curator at the Fleming Museum in Burlington. She made the call that afternoon. 2 conservators arrived within the week, driving up from Burlington in a vehicle whose size suggested they had been told to prepare for a significant find, and they spent 2 days in the Miller building with lights and gloves and the focused, unhurried attention of people who understand that what they are handling cannot be replicated and must be accorded exactly the care it requires. The 14 paintings were authenticated as works of Caleb Marsh, 11 of them previously unknown, 3 of them matching descriptions in Marsh's own correspondence of paintings he had given to Miller's safekeeping in the years before the fire. The Fleming's director came himself on the 3rd day and sat with Marion at the kitchen table and discussed, with the careful honesty of someone who wants to get this right rather than simply to acquire, the range of possibilities for the collection, from permanent institutional placement to private sale to a combination of both. He named figures. They were not small figures. Marion listened and asked questions and said she would think about it and thanked him for coming, which he did not expect from a woman in her position but which she meant completely. The legal documentation from Ephraim Miller's crate was delivered to the Vermont Land Trust, which spent 6 weeks reviewing it and determined that the original conservation instruments, while not enforceable in their 19th-century form, provided sufficient historical basis for a formal recognition process that would attach the Miller name to 3,000 acres of Vermont state forest land that had begun with his quietly purchased parcels more than a century ago. The Trust's director wrote Marion a letter that she kept in the document folder alongside Constance's and which she read sometimes in the evenings in the reading chair by the fire. Diana arrived on a Saturday in November, alone, without calling first, which Marion took as evidence of something new, a willingness to arrive without the prepared structure of a managed conversation. She came up the front path in the particular way of someone who has been driving a long distance with a difficult thing in their chest and has not yet decided how to set it down. Marion had the kettle on before Diana reached the porch. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Diana cried once, briefly and without apology, which was also something new, and Marion let her, and did not say it was all right, because some things are not all right and saying so is a kindness that costs too much. What she said instead was that she understood that her children loved her, and that love expressed as management is still love, and that she was not going to carry bitterness about it because bitterness is the one thing she had decided, on the drive north on a Thursday morning in October, that she could not afford. What she needed instead, she told Diana, looking at her daughter across the kitchen table in the Vermont November light, was to be trusted. Not managed. Not decided for. Trusted, the way you trust someone whose 81 years have earned them the right to know their own mind. Diana looked at her for a long moment and said, "I see that now." It was not everything. It was not the complete understanding that Marion might have wished for, but it was real, which was worth considerably more than a complete understanding that was only performed. Marion made fresh tea and they talked for another hour about things that had nothing to do with Maplecrest or the paintings or the sealed door, about Gerald, about Diana's daughter who was 12 and had recently decided she wanted to study marine biology, about the apple tree in the orchard to the west of the barn that Marion had identified as a variety she had never encountered and intended to have properly identified in the spring. Christopher called 2 weeks later, and they had a conversation that was shorter and less complete than the one with Diana but that contained, at its end, a genuine question: "Mom, are you happy there?" She had told him yes, and meant it, and heard in his silence that he was doing the work of believing her, which was all she had ever asked. Helen came at Christmas with her husband and their 2 youngest children, and the farmhouse was full for 4 days in a way it had perhaps never been full in Constance's time, and Marion cooked at the farmhouse range and the children ran in the field in the December snow, and Helen sat at the kitchen table on the last evening and told her mother that she thought the house suited her, which was perhaps the most perceptive thing any of her children had said in the entire year, and Marion told her. She agreed. The Fleming Museum announced the Marsh Collection acquisition in January, a joint arrangement that placed 11 paintings permanently in the museum's collection and returned 3 to a foundation established in Caleb Marsh's name for the support of Vermont artists. Marion had negotiated the arrangement herself, with the assistance of an attorney in Burlington whom Vera Osgood had recommended, and the terms were, as the attorney told her with the particular satisfaction of someone who has seen many such negotiations and recognizes a well-constructed outcome, everything she could have asked for. She was in the garden in the spring, the kitchen garden behind the house that she had been working through the winter months with the patience of someone who knows that gardens respond to attention in any season, when Declan Fosse came around the corner of the barn and told her that someone from the State Historical Society was on the telephone about the Miller documents and wanted to discuss a formal commemoration. She thanked him and went inside and stood at the kitchen window for a moment before picking up the phone, looking out at the field where the grass was beginning to come back green at its edges, where the path to the Miller building was clearly worn now from her own daily walking of it, from the visits of the conservators and the curators and the quiet scholars who had begun to find their way to Aldercroft to see the north wall that had held through a fire and through a century and through everything else that time and intention and the opposition of small-minded people can bring to bear against a thing that was built to last. She thought about Constance Morrow's letter. She thought about her father, James Calloway, who had known his sister in ways Marion had not known to ask about while he was alive to answer. She thought about Ephraim Miller, dead for more than a century, who had sealed a door in a stone wall and trusted that the right person would eventually come to it with the sense to understand what it was. She was 81 years old. She had a sealed door behind her and an open field in front of her and a farmhouse that was entirely her own and a garden coming back green at its edges in the Vermont spring, and she understood, with the completeness that only arrives when a thing is entirely true, that the most important rooms in a life are never the ones you were given. They are always the ones you had the courage to open. Thank you so much for watching until the very end. If this story reached you the way I hoped it would, please check out the other videos on your screen right now. I think they will find you well. And if you have not yet subscribed, now is the time. I will see you in the next story.